Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. We're so excited to share the power of healing from complex trauma with all of you. It's inspiring to know that so many of you tune in to learn about how healing from complex trauma is possible. Are you interested in deepening your understanding of NARM? We're excited to present the Inner Circle, NARM's online learning community. Each month, members receive direct mentorship from NARM creator Dr. Laurence, NARM training director Brad Kammer, and other NARM faculty as they present NARM demonstration sessions and provide extensive debriefs on applying NARM with real clients. They also present live topic webinars that deconstruct the various elements of complex trauma. Members also get access to archived material and other learning resources, as well as access to a private Facebook group with other professionals learning NARM around the world. The Inner Circle is a hub for the international NARM community where people working with complex trauma come together to connect, network, and develop trauma-informed projects to help our world. You, our Transforming Trauma listeners, can receive a free 14-day trial with access to the 3-month archive by visiting www.narmtraining.com/free trial. We are delighted to share with you a glimpse into the NARM Inner Circle online learning program. The Inner Circle is for those interested in joining an international community of helping professionals who are passionate about healing complex trauma. This program provides ongoing, in-depth learning from NARM creator Dr. Laurence and senior trainer Brad Kammer, as well as other NARM faculty. As a gift to you, our listeners, we're offering a special Inner Circle webinar as today's episode. This webinar was part of a series in the Inner Circle designed for a deeper exploration into how NARM works with the distortions of life force due to complex trauma. In this webinar, Larry and Brad discuss the NARM model of health and trust. The conversation reinforces and supports the embodiment of multiple NARM concepts. We hope you enjoyed this special episode of Transforming Trauma.
I'm looking forward to this particular segment because I think it's really important for everyone to understand what is this underlying model of health that really the rest of the model is built on. And different models have different understandings of what is healthy. And so what Brad and I are hoping to do today is to help clarify a little bit some of the deeper structure of the NARM model.
Yeah. As Larry, you and I were putting this together, I mean, we haven't fully articulated this yet. And there's in some of your teachings, your postmaster's teaching, and a little bit in the newest book, we kind of hinted at some of this, but we haven't quite spelled it out. So this will be fun for us to be able to take the time to spell it out a little bit more fully. Okay, so I think as most of you know, we like to start with a reflective exercise. And so I'll guide you through this and you can participate in whatever way works best for you. So we're going to invite you to reflect on a time when you found yourself efforting to regulate a client, or if you don't have any active clients, trying to regulate a friend, a family member, a child, or to get them to settle unsuccessfully. The time you were trying to regulate someone, efforting to regulate someone to get them to settle, and that was unsuccessful. And we'll just invite you, as you reflect, to bring up all the sensory details of that experience.
We're obviously, in this exercise, bringing your awareness to the limitations of trying to get people to regulate, particularly when we're talking about developmental trauma. Shock trauma is a little bit different, but with developmental trauma, it's really not primarily about regulation. Regulation is a byproduct of the work that we do, but it isn't that we try and regulate our clients. It's generally not only counterproductive, but overall it doesn't really work. So Brad and I will be going into more depth about that.
I was just going to share that I had this interesting experience in this exercise. Like I kept on thinking of clients and then it would immediately come back to me and feeling like I was unregulated. And then looking at how I was using my client as a way to try to regulate myself, which we talk a lot about in the trainings. But it was interesting how it just, every time I was thinking about a client, it came back to me unsuccessfully feeling regulated. The difference.
There's an interesting little line that we have in the new book, which is, how do you regulate a therapist? Put a client in front of them.
Exactly.
And that's really, it sounds kind of like a joke, but there's truth in that, and particularly for some particular survival styles. And also, even when therapists try to get into trying to regulate somebody, it's, our experience that that's often when they're feeling helpless or not knowing what to do or overwhelmed themselves, the therapist I'm talking about, and then they try and do something to the client. And obviously, we're taking the perspective that that's not the most useful way to go.
Okay, so let's start talking about what is this underlying model of health that really frames and shapes and directs NARM?
Well, for one thing, I always look at health on a continuum. So we're all hopefully on the road or the path to increasing health, both emotional health and physical health. And we know that they're, in many cases, very closely connected. And the model of health, the underlying structure that I was referring to earlier, is to be able to increasingly live in the body in the present moment without seeing things through the filter. Many other systems have talked about this, but they'll talk about filters of the past. And I would like to clarify that it's not filters of the past. They're maybe from the past, but they're actually the filters of our own survival styles and identifications, object relations, and so on, things that Brad and I have talked about in other webinars. So that, there's this interesting paradox in NARM is that as we experience increasing subjectivity and an increasing sense of an organizing self, that we are and we have this organizing self, we also experience increasing objectivity, meaning we're increasingly seeing the world as it is and through less and less filters of, our own adaptive survival mechanisms. And obviously, I doubt that any of us is going to arrive at enlightenment, and at least in this lifetime. I'm just kind of saying that sort of, offhandedly, because this is a more like an aspirational kind of process. We're all works in progress. And yet there is a very important continuum, because we all know people who are at different levels of that continuum. Some people who are seeing everything through the lens of their own unresolved issues and the distortions in their own sense of self, their distortions in their sense of the world. And the NARM model of health is this embodied, here and now objectivity that views the world and ourselves and other people through an increasingly less distorted lens.
One of the reasons why I was drawn to somatic psychology in the early days, and this relates back to the exercise we just did, is I was so interested in finding systems that from the starting point recognized that humans were self-organizing, self-regulating systems. And I know you and I have talked about that in other places, but I think that is something that's also really important because, the quote from your original book on NARM was about recognizing that connection, health, and aliveness is within all of us. And it's kind of saying the same thing, that basically given the right kind of conditions, there's an inherent sense of trust that people are already designed to be self-organizing and self-regulating. And does this fit with this model that you're describing here?
100%. As far as I know, actually, it was Wilhelm Reich who was the first person who actually talked about organismic self-regulation. But there are a lot of models that talk about it, but don't really believe that. It's like, if you really believe in organismic self-regulation, you don't have to work so hard to regulate people. What you have to do is, and that's how NARM is structured, is to explore the learned obstacles that are in the way of the kind of deep connection which brings with it regulation, increasing aliveness, living increasingly in the here and now. And so that's this underlying model of health, and consistent, with some other, particularly spiritual systems, but some other models, is that we believe that there is a part of us that is always untouched by trauma, in the sense that there's some level of experience that isn't distorted. If it weren't the case, we would all have a really difficult time helping ourselves and other people work through their trauma. So it's this spontaneous movement towards health that then meets these learned obstacles. And that, for those of you who are in the training, know that that's how the first pillar is organized, just around that specific theme. So this model of health is informing like all the 4 pillars, as well as the broader clinical work that Brad and I teach, and others as well are teaching.
What might be some terms that we could use to describe that aspect that you just described of that there's some part of ourselves that's not touched by trauma? Like, what would be some terms that might fit that are used?
Well, in spiritual traditions, they would talk about being or essence or various words that are, similar words like that are untouched by, the things that happen to us. What I'm reluctant to do is that I don't want to support this kind of spiritual bypass, because we need to do the work, the emotional work, the work on our sense of self. That those are the obstacles that get in the way, and many people try and bypass that and go right to being. Mm-hmm. So, I think probably the clearest sense of it is that there is something in all of us, and you can call it being, or you can call it essence, or you can call it a whole variety of different things, but something in all of us that knows the truth. It's like taking an extreme example. Let's say there's sexual abuse in the family. A child, hasn't been taught that this is wrong. Nowadays, people are teaching children more and more about inappropriate touching. But even before any of that teaching, there's some sense that it's wrong. And that's part of the challenge of working with people who've been experienced early, inappropriate touching or sexual abuse in the family. But it's hard to believe that part of ourselves and say, this is inborn. So the other things, too, is that we talk about in NARM that are related to this is all of these kinds of the basic needs that we have and the basic dynamics, we see them as psychobiological. Mm-hmm. So, for example, attachment itself, which is a core element in the NARM work and what we do as human beings to try and protect the attachment relationship, is, of course, both biological and psychological. We don't have to learn to have this impulse towards attachment, but when there's attachment failure, then we can give up on attachment on one level. But on the deepest level, that's what I mean, like this underlying level, there's always a part of us that longs for attachment, that longs for deep connection, because that is our nature. There's so many different studies out there that show that really is our deepest nature, to be connected, to be connected on a human level, in relationships with others, but also for many people to be connected to something that's even greater than ourselves. And so these dynamics come into play. And being connected in the body is also a very important element of this, because it's so easy to fool ourselves in our heads. Mm-hmm. But the body, it's the title of somebody's book, I'm sure, The Body Doesn't Lie. On that level, that's why they hook various kinds of lie detector machines to the body, because the body doesn't lie, but we can fool ourselves in our head. Mm-hmm. So that's why this embodied element is so important in NARM. And, we talk about embodied adult consciousness, and that's part of why that's so important in our work.
I just wanted to add one practical piece to what you were saying just before, is that's also the invitation of the first pillar. The invitation of the first pillar is that there's, just like you were saying, that there's something built into us that we've become very distant. We've become far from home, so to speak. Yeah. And so the first pillar is really a deeper invitation. I know we're working with it sometimes on a very kind of surface practical way, but it really is, we're holding this deeper invitation that people are wanting to come home. They're wanting to re-embody, reconnect. And that's the beginning invitation of that process.
That's a really good point. And sometimes to clinicians, we don't usually say this to clients, maybe exceptions. We say to try to give clinicians the feeling for what the intention is that starts the whole process. We're looking for what is the client's heart's desire. Mm-hmm. This part of us that no matter what we've experienced, still desires connection, regulation, attachment, closeness, belonging, all these very important elements.
Right. So how about the life force? This is something, we talk a little bit about in NARM, and this is not so much aligned with some of the more modern understanding of Western science, and yet it's so critical to this understanding of health. So can we talk a little bit about how we look at this in NARM, the life force?
Well, I see it a little differently in terms of modern science from in terms of what you just said. I think that it's just not on their radar.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like they're against it. It's like they've never even thought about it that way. And if you talk about it in a broader sense, like consciousness, one of the nice things about the scientific method is their honesty, because the neuroscientists will say and have written, they've tried to unlock, and find out what is consciousness. They're looking at, brain parts and neurochemicals. They're not going to find it there from my perspective. But in NARM, we do talk about the life force. There is something that animates us, and that word comes from anima, which means soul in Latin. And we all know that there is something there, and we know it when we feel it. We know when we feel more vital and more alive, and we long for that feeling of vitality and aliveness. And we know when we're feeling disconnected, shut down, not much energy available to us. And so many of the psychological and emotional symptoms that people experience have to do with, this disconnection from the life force. And again, in the first book, I presented how the life force gets distorted as we adapt to environmental failure of all kinds.
You said before that you don't think that like scientists are against it, but I think if we look at it through the core dilemma, there is part of people that is quote against it because they're afraid of it. And so, everyone has different strategies, but some people's strategies are to try to kill it or destroy it or to control it or repress it. And I do think that there's people, if we talk about people with strong connection survival style who go into science, they are the ones generally that are going to be driving to find those particles that can like explain the existence. So I do think it's something that, a model like NARM is going up against with some of these evidence-based approaches and the way that modern science is working. So, I'm sure there's different ways to define it.
So-called evidence.
So-called.
Yeah, because we can use that as an example. Think about, in some of these so-called evidence-based approaches, the whole model of health is just to extinguish symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
There isn't a deeper model of health. They're working to extinguish symptoms in a variety of different ways. Whereas in NARM, we look at symptoms as messages from this deeper self, messages that we've often had a hard time listening to. And so NARM fits very much into the segment of traditional psychotherapies that has an understanding of depth, where, as you're saying, Brad, there are some models that have built in this orientation towards a lack of depth. We're just focusing on behaviors. We're just focusing on the surface reaction. We're just focusing on getting rid of symptoms. And we have a very different perspective, obviously.
Yeah. Why is it important in NARM to recognize that health is a hardwired basic state that the organism is constantly seeking? I guess we talked a little bit already about this, but any more you want to say about?
Well, again, you can, for those of you who are in the training, you can see how that relates to the second pillar. Well, first it relates to, the contracting and the first pillar, but then if we clearly understand and get in our cells and our bones that this is a hardwired basic state that the organism is constantly seeking, then we don't have to try so hard as clinicians. What we do is we become present and curious, and we're helping the person explore the learned obstacles that are in the way of this push towards health that is there in all of us. And if there wasn't this hardwired push towards health, or this constantly seeking part of ourselves, there wouldn't be symptoms. Everything would just be shut down. But it's this conflict between this part that's pushing to the surface that wants to be recognized, the deeper aspect of who we are, that meets with the learned and experiences life-saving mechanisms that as adults, that once they did save our lives at one point, and as adults, they limit our lives.
Yeah, it's funny. After all these years, I've never heard you describe it in the way you just described that, in terms of that there would be no symptoms if we were fully shut down. That's very interesting. Yeah, think about that. Yeah.
Yeah, if that part that seeks life is gone, it doesn't exist, then we would just be where we are, and there wouldn't, I said it already, but there wouldn't be symptoms.
Great. Again, we talked a little bit about this, but let's talk more. This is something obviously that so many of us who are helping professionals struggle with. We burn ourselves out. We work so hard. We take so much responsibility for the process. And I think this is one of the things that I was so looking forward to with this webinar topic, because, and you've already been stressing this throughout the whole time so far, but just about how really recognizing and getting to know this inside ourselves, this model of health can support us to show up in a different way in our work. And so let's talk more about this non-efforting piece here.
Okay, well, let me start with a metaphor that I've occasionally used in the trainings, which is that, if we have a splinter, or we've read stories from World War II where somebody had a piece of shrapnel in their body, the body recognizes this as something that doesn't belong there and is, without any conscious effort, is pushing to get the splinter out. Or even shrapnel, for example. That's an extreme example, but it highlights this point that the body recognizes what is foreign. The body and the deeper self recognize what is foreign. And so we're trusting this basic life force. We're trusting this basic movement towards health. And we're helping the person tap into that. And when we start to try and fix as clinicians, we're actually communicating a certain kind of distrust in the client's own capacity. And there's an interesting dynamic that happens, is that as we work from this place of trust, clients learn to trust their own process more and more. So they become less self-rejecting, less self-condemning, because they start to see symptoms as opportunities and symptoms as something to be curious about, and communications. And so we don't have to run away from ourselves. And the more that we trust ourselves, the less we have to run away. And so much of human, what is traditionally called psychopathology, really just has to do with running away, particularly running away from feelings and emotions. Think of all of the things that we do to not feel. I mean, we can write a huge list from all kinds of substance abuse to overwork, to we can use sexuality that way, we can use exercise that way, we can use all kinds of compulsive behaviors as part of our understanding that that's the way we're trying to run away from what's deep in ourselves that's pushing to the surface. The more that we trust that deeper self is not our enemy, it's actually our friend, and that there's some part of us that's trying to communicate to us, the more trust we have, the less we have to run away from ourselves. And that running away from, our deeper selves does create so much suffering.
So now, as you were sharing, I was hearing a lot of pillar 3 now in terms of agency, the helping our clients start to become aware of things or ways they're treating themselves or relating to themselves that they're largely unconscious of, or they potentially justify or make sense of in different ways. Helping people start to see how they're unconsciously relating to themselves through self-shaming, through self-rejection, and opening up new possibilities that they can trust in themselves without having to use those old strategies.
In NARM, we see pillar 3 is, that we've internalized in various ways the environmental failure that we experience that's now in the way of this life force that we mentioned a few minutes ago. And we then carry that environmental forward in our lives and then relive it and project it and get stuck, in that whole dynamic. And, part of this major environmental failure piece and the child's reaction to that is that every child blames themselves for the environmental failure that they've experienced. That's the way the child's mind works. That's how they protect the attachment and the love relationship with the parents. And so that's why it's so, when clients come in, the more traumatized they are, the more self-loathing there tends to be. And so that's just the degree of self-rejection and self-hatred. Again, it fits in this big ecological system of understanding the personality, that it's there in direct response to the environmental failure that they've experienced and how they've tried to make sense of it. And it is agency, and agency comes into play here to see how they're actually carrying forward the environmental failure that they experienced and the adaptations that they made to the environmental failure, how they're carrying that forward into adulthood. And that's where maturity and increasing organization take place.
So it makes complete sense from that perspective that if a child learns to blame themselves, they're going to put so much energy, so much effort to figure out how they can fix this, because it's terrifying to move throughout childhood and into adulthood with this very deep sense that we're to fault for all the failure. And then it also then really maps very nicely for, when we're doing consultations with therapists or helping professionals, how when they start to feel like they don't know what they're doing, generally the strategy they move to is starting to effort harder. They start to push harder and go get new trainings and new skills and throw everything against the wall. And, again, this is where agency comes in, because we start to help people understand what's driving those behaviors. So it really seems to fit really nicely here with this efforting. Yeah, we haven't talked too much about this, but how does trust and confidence function as an antidote to control?
Well, in a sense, the way we put the question together, Brad, answers that, but I want to expand on it because, we all recognize parts of ourselves that are into controlling in different ways in different circumstances. And the antidote to that is to trust. It's like we believe we need to control when we don't trust in, our own, let's say, our own basic goodness, or don't trust in our bodies, or don't trust that our emotions have something really important to communicate to us. So we're trying to control all of these things. And the more that we try and control, the more that fuels our lack of trust and lack of confidence in this deeper self that is trying to make itself known. And so it becomes a vicious cycle for us. The more uncertain we feel, the more we try and control, the more we try and control, the more uncertain, or meaning including the lack of trust and lack of confidence in self, and it escalates. And a primary and extreme example of that is a panic attack. Mostly, like if we look at panic attacks, there's some kind of internal or external trigger, which then even if it's an external trigger, it triggers something internal to us. We believe that whatever this is that's scary to us, whatever it is that we start to feel, then we start to try and control that emotion or that reaction. And then we start to feel we can't control it. It starts to feel bigger. And then we put more control on it. And we start to, in this coupling, process, we start to get more and more anxious and more out of control. But that's in direct result of the fact that we're trying to control things that we would be better off listening to and being present to, rather than trying to run away from, in this example, through using some kind of control, which is basically sometimes either behavioral or body-based in terms of how we shut our bodies down.
Yeah, I was going to just say that this is a great bridge for our next month's webinar. So we can bookmark this moment here, because what we're going to be talking about next month is about physical armoring and the way that we brace ourselves, patterns of tension and collapse that, Larry, you were just describing. I think more of the tension pattern. So you start to get triggered, and then different people tense different muscle groups and stuff. But that often then we double down, triple down. And next thing we know, we have all chronic pain because our muscles have been holding for so long against feeling. And I think any of us that work in this field, there's such overlap between people that have had trauma and physical or chronic conditions.
It's a great point. And it's, I'm particularly interested in health, and read as much in that area as I can. And there's this increasing mainstream awareness of how developmental trauma and chronic pain are related. And that's such an important understanding for our culture, because look at the opioid epidemic. These are people who are trying to kill their pain. Often it did originate with some actual injury, but not always. But their vulnerability to these kinds of pain relief products is because there is so much emotional and physical pain that they're dealing with. And some of that physical pain, we know the science is pretty clear with it, that a lot of even the physical pain has an emotional component to it, even when there's an actual organic injury that's there.
Yeah, and it's amazing. I mean, this is going to sound funny the way I'm about to say it, but it's amazing how good those opiates actually work. I mean, that's the danger of them. They work so well because not only do they block the messages of pain, they produce the endorphin response. They produce the good feelings. So it's not just blocking the pain, they provide pleasure automatically. So it makes so much sense for someone who has not only had all these symptoms, but has struggled to find any source of pleasure in life, can't find satisfaction in relationships, in work, in family, disconnected from nature, from their bodies. And then they take this pill and immediately it all becomes available to them. I just so get why people, become addicted to those. I mean, I sometimes think about like in the old days, up until, 20, 30 years ago, it was alcohol. That was really what people, but opiates takes alcohol to a whole nother level. I mean, it's not even a comparison.
You make a really important point too, that I think we should talk more about it sometime in the future, which is this theme of pleasure. I think we could do a whole webinar just on pleasure, not just superficial pleasure, but a deep kind of pleasure that is part of being connected to the life force.
Yeah.
Whenever people talk about this deep kind of pleasure, like the pleasure in deep relationship or the pleasure of a certain kind of experience, it's always, coming from some kind of very deep place in them. And the lack of pleasure in human beings' lives is such a significant element in so much suffering. And that's, again, going back to what Brad said, that's one of the things that reinforces, the certain orientation towards medications or drugs of various kinds that help us get even little bits of pleasure here and there, because pleasure is part of the baseline human experience when we're connected. And pain is part of the baseline of being disconnected. So we'll have to come back to that at some point. I think it'd be a good subject.
I love it. Yeah. Pleasure and pain. That's
yeah, that would be good.
Very cool. All right. I got that for 2024.
Okay.
So how is trust in organismic self-regulation reflected in NARM's work with emotion? So you already kind of highlighted this a little bit, but I think let's go a little bit deeper into, because most folks on here have been in some level of training with us and they've probably read the book. So in chapter 7, we talk about the emotional completion process. So maybe we can bring that practical nature in as we talk about this.
Well, one of the things that I've challenged in some of the self-regulation models that they're often used to help people not feel certain emotions. And, in NARM, one of the questions that we ask, instead of trying to regulate or titrate or pendulate away difficult emotions, we do a kind of an inquiry. What's the scariest thing about whatever the particular emotion is? So we take them right into the core of the dilemma. And that's because there's trust that when they start to understand and work with their emotions, and in that process comes to some kind of completion that, which, as Brad mentioned, called the emotional completion process, that self-regulation, then there's trust in self-regulation, and to be able to not run away from these difficult. And when I say difficult, I'm not talking about just unpleasant emotions. Sometimes love and vulnerability and pleasure are all difficult emotions or experiences for people. So the more we trust that these emotions have something important to communicate to us, the more we listen to them, the more that we're able to tolerate all of the energy that is bound up in all of these disconnected emotions, the more aliveness we feel. And aliveness is part of the subject of this webinar, which is that aliveness is a key factor in health, physical health, emotional health. If you're feeling really alive, you're not going to be depressed. If you're feeling really alive, you're not going to be dissociated. Now, that's easier said than done. Obviously, we can't just flip a switch and feel alive. We have to work through the various obstacles in the way, but aliveness, embodied aliveness, and this deep kind of pleasure in being alive is so fundamental to the NARM model of health.
I was also kind of putting a few pieces together here about, again, one of the things that differentiates NARM, I think, from other models is that we're not focused on emotional expression or doing anything specific with our emotions. And there tends to be some kind of a efforting or performative quality in some other models, that it's like the idea is that we're trying to get our emotions out, whereas in NARM, that may or may not happen, but it's really about how we're reconnecting to this emotional energy that is part of the life force. And I think that's another piece, because otherwise it's like when people start to connect to these deep states, they want to do something with it. Like that's part of child consciousness. Like they can't separate out the feeling from having to do something around it. And it feels like it connects to that piece we talked about before with efforting and how we blame ourselves as children for all the environmental failure.
Well, I was, of course, part of a lot of the work in the 80s where there was about getting everything out. And I came to see, and it was one of the reasons I started moving away from that model, is I saw that it wasn't consistently helpful for people. Some people did okay with it, and it was helpful. But particularly people who are struggling with, who are less integrated, less sense of an organizing self, all of that emotional expression actually was decompensating for them. So NARM is much more about containment, being present to the energetic power that is held in the emotions, and at the same time listening to the message that we're trying to communicate to ourselves through that emotion. So we see emotions as communications. Also, to piggyback on what Brad was saying, is that in NARM, not all emotions are created equal. Some emotions, feeling and completing some emotions leads to growth and maturity. Other emotions can actually lead to regression and reinforcing the child consciousness. So that's part of the emotional completion process that we teach, which is how to help the client distinguish primary emotions from default emotions. Because default emotions keep us stuck in the same old groove over and over, whereas primary emotions lead to increasing depth. And depth, too, is part of this model of health that we've touched on a couple of times now.
Again, another piece of unlearning for many of us that are mental health professionals, because when we were being trained, we were kind of trained that all emotions are created equal. And that's, I remember a supervisor very early in my internship saying, I was telling them that the client started crying and she's like, okay, now you're doing therapy. And I was like, whoa, okay. I was a new therapist. I'm like, oh, okay. So the goal is that the client has some kind of emotional expression. I mean, I literally explicitly was being taught that. So it's interesting because, in some ways when people come into NARM trainings, there is some unlearning about that because they feel like they're misattuning if a client comes in and is having a big grief response or an anger response. But in NARM, we need to differentiate first if it's, like Larry said, supporting adult consciousness or child consciousness, because we wouldn't want to just necessarily go into an emotion if it's actually reinforcing disconnection. Right. And that's tricky territory for a lot of us, because then we feel like we're misattuning to them, we're not validating their experiences. And so, I mean, there's an art form of how we do that, but that's tricky when people first come into NARM, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, so relying on some of the research, you talked a little bit about all the study that you do still, but about ACEs, developmental trauma. How do we view chronic health conditions as a barometer for a client's level of organization and integration?
Well, fortunately, and again, this has been a lot of changes. I've been obviously in the field for many, many years, and we're getting more and more significant studies that tend to confirm just that chronic health conditions, many, not all, certainly some things are genetic. I'm not trying to, create a no exceptions kind of point of view here, but many chronic health conditions are, one is that, as I wrote about in the first book, it was so obvious to me, and now there's actually medical clinical evidence is that early developmental trauma and the adaptations that we make to it are linked to chronic inflammation. And we know, even in the 15 years since the book was written, there have been so many significant studies that I've read that have confirmed just that. And the other side is still true, where I see people talking about, they know that stress, whatever that, that word, is related to some of these chronic health conditions. But I've seen so many other just articles, not research stuff. Stress is only seen as situational. And there's very little orientation to the fact that how much stress we carry with us and continue to create as through our adaptive survival styles. It's not just, it includes situational, but it's not just situational. And even our reactions to situational stress is often determined by our survival styles, our unresolved identifications, and so on. So that, but this deeper understanding that developmental trauma is so significant in so many different conditions, some of which have been obvious for some time and some of which we are just discovering more recently, or at least getting scientific evidence for.
Yeah, it's a pretty exciting time in terms of all the research that's coming out about ACEs. And I also wanted to say that I heard again this reinforcement of agency there about like helping clients start to see how these patterns that have adapted from early adaptations and we're still bringing into our present life, how it's always tricky because there's like that whole movement in the 80s about like you are your health, and there was a way that got used to blame people for their illness, and we don't want to do that in NARM. And this is the art of agency, because we want to make sure that we're using it to reinforce people and not to reinforce the blame that people will already people who get cancer blame themselves, and it's like that's not going to be helpful at all. And we want to help people start to understand the way that they're relating to some of these patterns that potentially do make them a higher probability that they can develop some. I mean, if you have inflammation, there's lots of research out there that you're going to have a higher likelihood of developing certain forms of cancer. That's just what we know now in science. And
cancer, heart disease, stroke, all kinds of yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, this is a little bit outside of kind of, where we go in our individual therapy as therapists, at least. But, these worlds are coming together closer, and, it is exciting to see this happening. So anything you want to say just in terms of like how NARM does specifically address chronic health conditions?
Well, first, we want to make sure that the client, that there's a clear contract, because many clients will come in, for example, with a chronic health condition, and they're, without stating it necessarily even directly, by coming to see a psychotherapist for a chronic health condition, we're assuming that they see an emotional component in this chronic health condition. Now, we want to verify that first. That is their assumption, because otherwise we're not, some NARM therapists are medical doctors, but even so, if they're coming in for NARM work, they're coming in for emotional, psychological, psychotherapeutic kinds of work. So first we have to get a clear understanding from the client that they see an emotional element, and then we can contract around that we'll explore, one, if that's actually even true, because there could be some kind of chronic health conditions that don't have anything to do with developmental trauma. And so there's a specific way then that I approach, and I'm assuming you can tell me if this is similar to what you do, Brad, but I'll often start with, let's say they have whatever the chronic health problem is. I will start to get a lay of, kind of a landscape of their symptoms. First question I ask is, are there times when you're symptom free, or when the symptoms are much less, troublesome? And if they say yes, then I say, tell me about your life in those periods. And they'll first will start to focus, well, I'm feeling better because my chronic health condition is feeling. But I say, but let's look at it the other way around. I'm wondering, like, maybe there's something going on in your life that this chronic health condition isn't flaring up so much at this period. And let's talk about that. We try to find what are the emotional and relational patterns that are there in those periods when the person's symptoms are better. And then, of course, the next step would be the converse. We would want to look at, and those times when you have real flare-ups, for example, of whatever the symptom is, what's going on in your life then? What's going on internally to you? What's going on externally? And what are your reactions to that? So we're getting a sense of what the connection between this chronic health condition is and their underlying emotional state. And then as we see patterns start to emerge, we start to work with the unresolved emotions and maybe inadequate coping mechanisms that a person has, and in whatever context that we're talking about, to see, and as we work through this emotional completion dynamic, and as self-regulation spontaneously occurs as there's emotional completion, and we start to see that the diminution of some of these symptoms of chronic health conditions, we start to see patterns that we can then build on to move forward with, so that there can be increasing awareness of their part in whatever chronic health condition they're struggling with. And again, I'm not saying that all chronic health conditions are emotionally driven. There's epigenetics. That's a whole other dynamic that we're not going to have time to get into in this particular webinar. But so I'm not trying to oversimplify, but we do know, I think all of us know, that chronic unresolved emotions and unresolved distortions in our sense of self create all kinds of suffering, including some of these chronic health conditions that people struggle with or that human beings struggle with.
And again, I think a lot of gratitude to the trauma-informed movement that you've been part of for many years. Because 20, 30 years ago, this wouldn't have been such a common understanding. In fact, you would have gotten a lot of pushback. And now, not only is it a common understanding, but it's integrated outside of mental health. It's integrated into all sorts of different systems. And there's a long way to go, of course, but we're off to we're at a better place than we ever have been, for sure, at least in this society.
A little anecdote: 35 years ago, a colleague of mine, we saw many things similarly. He presented something along this line, so nothing more extreme than this. He actually got censured.
Uh-huh.
Now, that was some time ago, but just to kind of reaffirm or confirm what you were saying about the pushback.
Yeah.
The thing we do want to avoid, and you touched on it as well, Brad, is that we're not talking about blaming yourself.
Mm-hmm.
We're not looking in the Louise Hayes cookbook for, this causes that. It's never that simple.
Yeah.
But we do want to see where we can intervene for ourselves. That's agency. Yeah. Self-blame is not agency, but how we can, both on a behavioral level and on an emotional level, how things can shift for us.
I don't know why I just keep on thinking of that book, Anatomy of an Illness. I think it was Norman Cousins. Was that his name? Who had...
You're right, yeah.
Had an inoperable cancer, I think, and ended up just focusing on pleasure and laughter every day. And then he went into remission. And it's interesting. So then he wrote this whole book about the anatomy of his illness based on this idea of the life force, which also was very aligned with Reich's idea. Reich believed that cancer biopathy, he called it, was where the cells actually started to resign. Mm-hmm. They started to kind of give up. And his idea was, how can we help the cells on this very atomic level start to feel energy again? So interesting, again, how people that were way ahead of their time got so attacked. And now this is coming into more common understanding.
Another just very specific area that I think a lot of people can relate to are back problems.
Mm.
It's like there is a purely mechanical orientation, and some back problems may be purely mechanical. But there have been a couple of writers, physicians over the last 20 years who addressed the role of unresolved emotions in chronic back problems. And certainly anecdotally, both you and I and many of the people who are watching have experienced how these conditions of, chronic back pain, for example, can ameliorate or sometimes even go away as the person progresses through therapy, as emotional completion happens, and as their sense of self gets stronger and less distorted.
Yeah. Well, we've talked quite a bit about this. Anything else you want to say as we start to wrap this up?
Yeah, well, it's such basic trust. It is so basic. It's so fundamental. And when our first experiences of the world have significantly challenged that basic trust, in other words, that we've come not to, to be disconnected from some kind of sense of basic trust, then that is the underlying kind of stratum that informs so much that comes later. Because if we can't trust in ourselves and we can't trust in our caretakers, then we're left to manage in what feels like a cold and unloving world. Mm-hmm. And we adapt the best we can, but often in ways that are then dysfunctional themselves, because we're trying to find and control and tensing and all of the things that we're going to talk about next time come into play in this process. Is that we start shutting down, we start armoring, we start going into collapse, which is kind of just a reaction to chronic tensing. So all of basic trust, it has to be relearned in the sense that it's there waiting for us, so to speak, but we have to learn to be able to access it. That's a better way to put it than what I just put it. It's always there on some level. If it weren't there, I don't think we would survive. Because how could we go to sleep at night if we don't have some basic trust that we're going to wake up in the morning? How could we get on an airplane? Some people don't, but how could we get on an airplane if we don't have some kind of basic trust? And we take this basic trust that we have for granted.
Yeah.
We tend to focus on where we don't have it because it is problematical. But basic trust is so fundamental to, some kind of satisfying and joyful and connected human experience in human life.
Well, I'm so grateful that we have this model of NARM because it's so woven in at the foundation, and it's beautiful and graceful and hopeful. And so, thanks again for guiding us through this, Larry.
Yeah, thanks.
So as our kind of wrap up reflective exercise, we're going to invite you to take a few moments to reflect on a time when you felt implicitly and or explicitly trusting in yourself and the universe, just what Larry was describing. Just to take a few moments to feel into this. Just feel kind of moved to also share just how special it is to be able to share this in a community as well. I mean, there's one thing to be able to experience it ourselves. It's another thing to be able to share it together. And, unfortunately, we can't all be in person in these meetings, but many of us have met in different ways and just continue to appreciate the community that we have here. So thank you all for participating in this. And in terms of we've talked a lot about what we're going to be doing next month. We have one on physical armoring, which will be really interesting. And then this is kind of like the last one in July. That's kind of in this whole series we've been doing around aliveness and life energy. We're going to be talking about tolerating positive affects, which Larry mentioned briefly here today. And then this is one that, Larry, I've heard you teach about OCD in the past. Super interesting and very important when working particularly with the earliest survival style patterns. And then this is one that people continue to request about support with the attunement survival style for us as helping professionals. This is a huge obstacle for many of us in being more in the present moment. And then keep your suggestions coming because we're taking them for 2024 at this point. So in the Facebook group, you can let us know if there's other topics you'd like us to get to.
Yeah. We, like Brad was saying, we appreciate your input. We try to, to tailor this to what your requests and your wishes. So let us know if you find the single sessions more helpful sometimes, or if you'd like to see ongoing work. We want your feedback.
All right. Well, thank you, Larry, and thanks to everyone. And we'll be together very soon.
Yeah. Thanks, Brad. Good to be back here.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Are you interested in deepening your understanding of NARM? We're excited to present the Inner Circle, NARM's online learning community. Each month, members receive direct mentorship from NARM creator Dr. Laurence and NARM training director Brad Kammer, access to NARM demonstrations with extensive debriefs, and the opportunity to engage with the hub for the international NARM community. Dive in with a free 14-day trial and access the 3-month archive by visiting www.narmtraining.com/free trial. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.